And that is why tonight's remarks will turn our attention to one singular and high-profile agenda of our strategic plan, and that is our work in the capital city. Our work in Boston can be a very polarizing agenda for people. I receive letters in the mailbag from members applauding our efforts to do more in the city. Scores and scores of people I will never meet write positive comments on Boston Globe articles. The praise carries statewide. From cocktail parties at Namkeg to town meetings in Lincoln, it is what I get asked about. Is it true that Trustees is saving the Boston waterfront? Go Trustees! Who else but you guys? How thankful we are that you are bringing leadership to this area. And of course, there are the critics and the worriers. Why all this emphasis on the city? Why put all this energy into one place, an expensive one at that? Or the appropriate question, what happens if you fail? To which the thought always passes in my mind, oh, but what if we succeed? So tonight we take a journey through Boston for the advocate, for the critic, for the historian, for the dreamer, and remember how it is that the Trustees of Reservations became so focused on Boston. So we go all the way back to the beginning, and that is the beginning before the beginning of the Trustees, and a letter written by Charles Eliot in January 1890 that was the origin of his thinking around our founding. It is everywhere agreed that a great and growing population, such as now inhabits Boston and her wide-spreading suburbs, should, for its own best health, provide itself with all possible open spaces. Boston is far behind in this matter. Large areas outside of the old city are wholly unprovided with public open spaces. Boston, like New York, may yet be compelled to tear down whole blocks of buildings to provide herself with the needed oasis of light and air. Eliot continues, the providing of what I call parks is necessary for the preservation of the civilization of cities. It is an influence which has a most peculiar value as an antidote to the struggling and excitement of city life. What can we do to satisfy the need to be close to nature that burns within us? End quote. Eliot penned this letter 10 years after the first national studies on parks was published and 26 cities nationwide were studied. Boston was last on the list for quality park space in 1880, even though by that time we had the Public Garden, the Common, the Arnold Arboretum. Boston was last on the list. This was an embarrassment to a city that saw itself worthy of the global stage. To be far behind international cities like London and Paris, and even places like St. Louis and Baltimore, was of disappointment to Boston's elite. And thus the Trustees of Reservations were formed to quell the ills of a growing Boston, to provide access to special places that stir the soul, to serve our health, to elevate society, for Boston, for everyone. With us, the idea of holding land for public benefit was launched. The need for better city planning that incorporated open spaces was developed. Park commissions and agencies to serve our residents were created. It is important to remember that the national trend in parks in the 19th century was all about parks on a city's edge. Think Central Park, for example, the retreat from the city. So it is not a surprise that we began acquiring country parks throughout Massachusetts, while the city was commissioning similar country parks in Boston shortly after our founding. And parks began to flourish statewide. Franklin Park, 1885, the banks of the Charles River, 1910, now known today as the Esplanade. By 1920, Boston had successfully grown from 171 acres to 2,330, managed by the city of Boston. And then in the 20th century, the park aesthetic changes. And that is, people desire a retreat not at the edge, but an active space within. Rose Kennedy Greenway, all of this progress. But in 1970, 80, 90, even 2000, the city holds fast at 2,330 acres. Today, it owns 2,346 acres of parkland, just 16 more acres than in 1920. Economic progress and densification over this period caused a great diminishment of Boston's natural assets. For every park added, space was lost elsewhere. The Boston Redevelopment Authority in 1976 recorded, in the last 100 years, an estimated 6,000 acres of coastal wetlands within the inner portion of Boston Harbor have been destroyed. Over half of the city's wetlands have been lost. Salt marsh is a rare resource in our city today. I can say two things about this. First, it's important to remember that Boston has gained much prosperity from development of these lost places, and that prosperity has benefited communities all over Massachusetts, including those served by the trustees. Second, when I found this entry by the BRA, I can tell you I was really excited that someone in the agency in 1976 cared about salt marsh. In times of growth, there can be an extraction of resources provided by open space, and it's not been a pretty time for parks. And that national list of open space in the US that angered Eliot in 1890, Boston has moved up to number 13, beating out St. Louis, but behind Madison, Wisconsin, spending just 40% of what San Francisco does on its parks, and barely equal with Las Vegas and Tampa, Florida, for park acreage available by resident. Thus, our re-entry back into Boston in the early 2000s was not a surprise. Boston was returning to a population that it hadn't been since the 1960s. Open space protection was not moving the needle enough, barely adding back what was being developed. This caused much concern for us, leading to a 2005 board discussion titled Establishing a Boston Presence, and focused on several possibilities to grow special places in the city. Just a few of the remarks to summarize this intense debate. Nick Noon observed that this was a 21st century move by trustees to fulfill its mission. Peter Madsen stated that in order to save the irreplaceable for everyone forever, a huge coalition of supporters needs to be built. Former board chair Sid Smithers, if you aren't focused on Boston, then the work achieved in Berkshires is irrelevant. And thus the affiliation of Boston Natural Areas Network on June 15, 2005 was voted, marrying the mission that cared about iconic open space with the organization with a track record of serving Boston residents. Flash forward to today. Here is a picture of our work in Boston. 56 community gardens involving 17,000 people a year. Following the 2012 merger of the South End Lower Roxbury Open Space Trust, we become caretakers for 37 acres in the city. We help found the Boston Public Market and now deliver educational programs to over 20,000 people annually in the kitchen. We provide our farm produce to 6 neighborhoods served by our new mobile market. We celebrate employment of over 1,500 Boston youth in our workforce development program. And finally, 60 years later, a return to Boston as headquarters of the Trustees of Reservations. Not bad for a decade's worth of focus, but I know you agree, it is simply not enough. And it's not just for lack of open space, which we can agree is a problem to be solved. It's for what we know Boston must be, a priority for a world-class organization in a world-class city in a world-class state. Our capital is benefiting from an enviable, healthy economic bubble, and consequently a booming real estate market with 13% more housing units in the last decade, much of this on the water. When Amos was founding Cablevision, his office was surrounded by a desolate part of the city, now vibrant. The seaport was no man's land, now a full commercial center, a new Boston within Boston. There have been improvements in the public realm that make the Boston waterfront more accessible and experiences in nature more available. And yet, for all this progress, the city with a booming Boston Harbor and a peaceful Charles River waterfront doesn't even make one of the many lists for top waterfront cities. BBC, Travel and Leisure, Forbes, Frommer's, and more, not even on the list. So what cities are on this list? European destinations? Baltimore, Chicago, Seattle. All because they share a common thread of beautiful and accessible coastline, stunning views, multiple options for recreation, and community engagement along the water. And nature, nature, nature. So who cares about rankings? Perhaps this one will be of interest. One list we are on the top of is the most vulnerable cities on the coast, where we land the number 2 spot. Other cities are investing in beautiful waterfronts, and even more important, they are driving green infrastructure and new parks to support resilient waterfronts. If Crane Beach is experiencing ice boulders, what happens to a city built on old salt flats and walls of concrete? This, my friends, is not about climate change. It's about this, or this, or this. Flooding in Boston has become a regular occurrence, 25 days last year. Sea level rise is happening here in Boston, and it's affecting a vulnerable waterfront that holds so much responsibility for Boston and the Commonwealth's economic, social health, and its centuries-long ambition to be the world-class city on the hill. Let me just lay out the scenario upon us. A challenged city parks budget and limited acreage added in the last 50 years. Increased densification of people and infrastructure, a vibrant economy in the city that drives the health of the whole state, and an inevitable vulnerability to climate change. So what role is there for our organization at this moment? As the nation's oldest, the state's largest entity created to provide nature and culture for people, what can we do as the entity with deep experience in caring for coastline, in engaging the public, in providing parks for everyone forever? We embody what Trustees has always done and respond to the need for leadership, the call to action. We create the opportunity for solutions where others can't or won't. Just like Eliot and Olmsted were our 19th century leaders in drawing upon the inspiration of other magnificent cities by creating retreats from city life, so can we today. And of course, there are risks, reputational, financial, time and energy. But the examples of success, my friends, are out there, of entities like ours, in cities like ours, reimagining land like ours, and in just recent years. Beautiful creations with innovative funding models, providing climate resilience, promoting public access, resilient, sustainable, open, accessible, world-class. The same values we bring to all of the 120 miles of waterfront in our care. This is what we want for the old residents of East Boston or the new neighbors of South Boston. This is what we want for the place that was our beginning and the places of our future. After 3 years of our One Waterfront initiative, we have the needed ingredients. There is public will, a mayor's commitment to new parks and better climate solutions, all the visionary leaders needed, philanthropic, civic, corporate, and nonprofit, and places to be reimagined. All of our work begun here and across the Commonwealth for the last 127 years prepares us for this monumental task. This is how we can satisfy the need for nature that burns within us. We aspire to raise unprecedented contributions, to broker the most complicated land deals we've ever done, to negotiate bureaucratic red tape, to conceive new levels of engagement, to dream, to grow, to stretch the organization, because in the end, the entire organization will be lifted to new heights. From one point, many streams will converge. Al Creighton's service, Amos Hostetter's dedication, the collective passion and work in this room, all for the same idea. We hope to protect our world for today, for tomorrow, for our children's children, in Boston, in cities, in towns and communities across the Commonwealth. And that, at the end of the day, is what parks are for. Thank you for being on this journey with us. Good evening.